Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast on the consumption function. Consumption constitutes a key component of the economy of a country, so it's important to understand what are the determinants of consumption and what are the different forms that the consumption function can take. First of all, the income of households has only two possible uses: consumption and savings. So when we talk about the determinants of consumption, we also talk indirectly about the determinants of savings. For a long time, economists thought that consumption and savings were essentially determined by the interest rate. According to the classics and neoclassics, an increase in the interest rate can result in a decrease in present consumption in order to increase savings and future consumption. This is the substitution effect. There can also be an income effect. An increase in the interest rate means an increase in future income, which may encourage households to save less and consume more. So, to sum up, households decide how much to save according to the interest rate, and what's left will be dedicated to consumption. In other words, consumption is a residual. It is what is not saved. The interest rate, in this context, is at the center of this trade-off between consumption and savings. What about the effect of prices? Well, the effects are ambivalent. On one hand, to keep their real assets at the same level, households save more in case of inflation. On the other hand, in the short term, inflation can encourage households to consume more right now before prices increase further. Keynes brought some new ideas to the debate. First, he claimed that the focus should be put on consumption and that savings are the residual. Second, he claimed that consumption is determined by the current income and not by the interest rate. He also adds that there is an incompressible consumption, which does not depend on the income and which is an expense dedicated to essential needs, which must be done whatever the revenue. Hence, for Keynes, the consumption is an affine function that depends on the current income with an incompressible component. The marginal propensity to consume measures the share of an increase in income that is allocated to an increase in consumption. It is the derivative of the consumption function. In our example, it is equal to the constant C1. It is different from the average propensity to consume, APC, which measures the share of income dedicated to consumption. In terms of math, it implies dividing the function by y. According to Keynes, when the income increases, consumption increases, but less quickly than income. This is the fundamental psychological law, and it implies that the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. Given that the income has only two possible uses, it also means that savings grow more quickly than income. This can be explained by the fact that the growth of income must satisfy more and more needs, and so a higher share of the surplus of resources can be attributed to savings. The fundamental psychological law is directly given by the Keynesian consumption function. Again, consumption increases when the income increases, but less quickly. Another way to represent this fundamental psychological law is to represent the average propensity to consume, APC, and the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, on the same graph. The APC decreases with income, so the share of consumption in income decreases and tends towards the MPC. The Keynesian consumption function was contested by several economists. Through a series of empirical studies on consumption, including a study published by Simon Kuznets in 1946. These studies confirmed that in the short term, the Keynesian consumption function was verified. As income increases, the APC decreases. However, Simon Kuznets uses data from the US between 1869 and 1937 to show that in the long term, the APC was constant. In other words, in the long term, the consumption function is not affine, but linear. To explain these differences between short-term and long-term, several theories were put forward based on the key role of expectations. According to Friedman, economic agents not only use their current income to determine their effective consumption. He claims that the effective consumption can be divided into two categories: permanent consumption and transitory consumption. Permanent consumption constitutes the largest share and the most stable. It depends on a permanent income. Basically, the permanent income corresponds to the average income expected by the agents in the long term. Agents make their decisions regarding consumption based on this permanent income and not on their current income, which is a transitory income that is fluctuant. In other words, according to Friedman, there are conjunctural events that can explain partly the variations in consumption, the transitory consumption. However, the essential part of this variation depends on the permanent income. This is why consumption is empirically stable, despite the fact that we observe large variations of the current income over time. This implies that an unexpected increase in the transitory income will not have any effect on the demand as long as the permanent income remains stable. This illustrates the fact that, according to Friedman, stimulus policies aiming at increasing the demand are inefficient because they affect the transitory income without affecting the expectations of the permanent income. The second theory that is based on the role of expectations is the analysis of Modigliani. He claims that agents anticipate, but in a different way, over their life cycle. He assumes that agents want to have a stable consumption over their life and that they finance this consumption through borrowings when they need to or through their savings when they have some. That way, consumption remains constant over time, even though the income varies at different stages of their lives. To each stage, youth, active life, retirement, corresponds a certain level of income and specific needs. For instance, paying the school fees of children, buying a house, and so on. To keep a constant level of consumption over time, agents borrow when they're young, save when they work, and consume when retirement comes. Modigliani therefore assumes that the consumption depends on the expectations that agents have of their income, and that agents will borrow or save at different stages of their life. Of course, this assumes that agents can easily access credit. Alright, so we've been talking about consumption for a while now, and we still haven't mentioned the role of prices. Yet, in microeconomics, you learn that consumption depends on relative prices, right? If the price of good X increases, the consumption of good X will decrease. In macroeconomics, we don't care about relative prices, but we do care about the general level of prices. In the Keynesian function, the general level of prices does not appear because consumption depends on the disposable income. Yet, there are other forms of consumption functions that show a relationship between prices and household consumption. Here, we're going to describe two possibilities. The first one is the wealth effect. Households not only look at their current income, but also at their assets, their wealth. By wealth, we mean the stock of bonds and money that households have at the beginning of the period. In real terms, if prices decrease, the real value of assets increase, which encourages households to save less, because now they need less savings to maintain constant the real value of their assets. In this case, consumption increases. In other words, we can see here a consumption function with wealth effects with the general level of prices that is in the function. The second example is the consumption function with distribution effects. The income can be split into two categories: salaried income, wages, and non-salaried income, interests and dividends. Keynes made the assumption that the income from wages and other types of income were consumed in the same way, meaning that they have the same propensity to consume. In reality, we observe that households have a higher propensity to consume their wages than to consume income coming from interests or dividends. This has been shown by several econometric studies. Non-salaried income are usually earned by wealthier households who don't necessarily need these revenues for their consumption and have a tendency to save these revenues. So, in our functions with distribution effects, we will make the verified assumption that the marginal propensity to consume salaried income is higher than the marginal propensity to consume non-salaried income. This means that C prime 1 is higher than C prime 2. In this case, an increase in prices will have different impacts on consumption. On one hand, an increase in prices will decrease the consumption of salaried income. On the other hand, it will increase the consumption of non-salaried income. Given that the propensity to consume salaried income is higher, the net effect on consumption will be negative. When prices increase, consumption decreases. We can see that in the function. Wn over P are the salaried income, and Y minus Wn over P the non-salaried income.